The doors of the great hall slammed open before Elena Voss could stop walking, and every eye in the room turned to her at once. She had not wanted to come. She had told Nora that morning, while grinding herbs into paste for a fever tonic, that gatherings like this were not meant for healers like her. But the summons had not asked for her opinion. It had simply arrived, sealed with the mark of the Alpha King, and refusal was not a word anyone used when that mark was involved. Now she stood at the entrance of a hall filled with silk, gold, and wolves, who had never known hunger a day in their lives, and she felt the weight of every stare pressing against her plain brown dress. Alpha King Damien Cross sat at the far end of the hall, on a raised chair, that was not quite a throne, though everyone treated it as one. He was younger than she expected, sharp-jawed, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that made a room quiet without him saying a word. When his eyes found her, something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like a man noticing a piece on a board he had not accounted for. "Elena Voss," he said, and her name in his voice carried across the entire hall. "Come forward." She walked, because there was no other choice. The crowd parted for her, the way water parts for a stone dropped into it, reluctantly, and closing again the moment she passed. When she reached the base of his chair, he stood. That alone made the hall murmur. Kings did not stand for healers. "You saved 12 of my border guards last winter," Damien said. "You crossed enemy territory to do it, alone, without asking permission from anyone in this room." "They needed help," Elena said simply. "I did not think permission mattered more than their lives." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the nobles near the front, though it was not unkind. Damien did not laugh. He studied her for a long moment, then reached into the folds of his coat, and drew out a small box carved from pale wood. "For that," he said, "I would like to give you something." He opened the box. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a moonstone pendant, pale blue and glowing faintly, even in the candlelight of the hall. Elena did not know much about court customs, but she knew enough to recognize the shape of the setting, the old pack symbols carved into the silver chain. She had seen drawings of gifts like this in Margaret's old healing texts, the kind given only once, and only to the person a king intended to claim as his own. The hall went utterly silent. Elena looked at the pendant, then at Damien's face, and she felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with fear of him, and everything to do with a memory she had spent 3 years trying to bury. She remembered another man's hands placing a gift around her neck. She remembered how kind it had felt in the beginning, and how quickly kindness had turned into control, until every gift became a leash disguised as affection. She remembered promising herself, in the quiet hours after she had finally broken free, that she would never again let a piece of jewelry decide the shape of her life. "I can't accept this," she said. The words landed in the hall like a dropped glass. Someone near the back audibly gasped. Damien's outstretched hand did not move, but something behind his eyes flickered, surprise perhaps, or something closer to disbelief. "You misunderstand," he said carefully, his voice low enough that it seemed meant only for her, though the whole hall strained to hear. "This is not a small thing to offer." "I understand exactly what it is," Elena said. "That is why I cannot take it." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Damien's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the particular stillness of a man recalculating something he had believed certain. He closed the box slowly, deliberately, and returned it to his coat. "As you wish," he said, and his voice, though even, carried an edge that had not been there before. Elena bowed, because that was expected, and turned to leave. She could feel his eyes on her back the entire walk to the doors, and she could feel, more than see, the hundreds of other eyes following his, cataloging her, judging her, already reshaping the story of what had just happened into whatever version would spread fastest through the corridors of power. By the time she reached the courtyard outside, her hands were shaking, not from fear of punishment. She did not think Damien Cross was the kind of king who punished refusal with violence. What frightened her was something quieter, the sense that she had just stepped into a story, much bigger than the quiet, careful life she had built for herself, a life made entirely of herbs, bandages, and the small, steady comfort of never depending on anyone who could hurt her. Nora was waiting near the gates, arms crossed, dark curls escaping her braid. Well, she said, you're still breathing, so that's something. I said no, Elena said quietly. Nora's eyebrows rose so high they nearly vanished into her hairline. No to what? To the king. Elena. Nora grabbed her arm, pulling her into the shadow of the courtyard wall, where fewer ears could listen. No to what exactly? Elena told her. She watched the color drain slightly from her friend's face, as she explained the pendant, the silence in the hall, the way Damien's expression had shifted from confidence to something colder. You know what that gift means, Nora whispered. Everyone in that room knew what it meant. I know what it meant to me, Elena said. That's why I said no. They walked home in silence after that, past the market stalls closing for the evening, past packs of young wolves laughing over some private joke, past the small stone house Elena had lived in since she'd left her old pack behind. The sun was setting behind the northern hills, painting the sky the color of embers, and for a moment Elena let herself believe the matter was finished. She had said no. The king had accepted it, however coldly. That would be the end of it. She was wrong, though she would not learn how wrong until 3 days later, when a messenger arrived at her door carrying something far larger than a small wooden box. News of what had happened in the hall spread faster than any fever Elena had ever treated. By the following morning, half the village seemed to know some version of the story, though the versions varied wildly, depending on who was telling them. Some said Elena Voss had insulted the king out of pride. Others whispered that she was secretly promised to another man and had refused out of loyalty. A few, mostly the older healers who remembered what a moonstone pendant truly represented, said nothing at all, only watched her with new and careful eyes whenever she passed. Margaret, the elder healer who had trained Elena since she was a girl of 12, with more curiosity than sense, found her grinding willow bark in the workshop the next afternoon, and set down her cane with a heavy thud. You could have simply said you needed time to think, Margaret said. That is what wolves like him understand. A firm no, in front of his entire court, is not something a king forgets easily. I didn't want to give him false hope, Elena said, not looking up from her work. It would have been crueler to pretend. Kindness is not always about being gentle in the moment, child. Sometimes, it means protecting yourself from a mistake you'll spend years undoing. Margaret's voice softened. I am not saying you were wrong. I am saying you should prepare yourself. Men like Damien Cross are not accustomed to hearing that word. It will not sit well with him, however calm he seemed. Elena said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like fear, and she refused to give her fear a voice in front of anyone, even Margaret. She thought of Gideon then, though she tried not to. She thought of the first months with him, when every gift had felt like proof of love, rather than the first thread of a net closing slowly around her. She thought of how long it had taken her to recognize the difference, and how much longer it had taken to walk away. She had built her entire life since then around a simple rule. Never again let someone else's generosity become the reason she stayed somewhere she did not want to be. That rule had cost her comfort. It had cost her a place at her old pack's table, a home she once thought she would never leave, friendships that quietly dissolved when she chose her own peace over their approval. But it had also given her something she valued more than any of it. It had given her the right to say no, and mean it, without needing anyone else's permission to do so. She did not regret her answer to the king. She only worried, quietly, about what a king unused to refusal might do next. 3 days later, she found out. It began with the sound of hooves and wagon wheels outside her small stone house, far too many for a quiet village street. Elena stepped outside to find a procession that seemed entirely out of proportion to her modest front garden. 6 guards in the deep blue of the royal house, 2 wagons, and in the center of it all, a chest large enough to hold a grown man, bound in gold fittings that caught the afternoon light like small fires. A young guard stepped forward, cleared his throat, and unrolled a scroll with visible nervousness. By order of Alpha King Damien Cross, he read, this gift is presented to Elena Voss, healer of the northern village, in recognition of her service, and in correction of any misunderstanding regarding his previous offering. The chest was opened before she could protest. Inside, nestled in dark cloth, sat an entire collection of treasures, jeweled combs, bolts of fabric finer than anything sold in the village market, a set of silver healing tools, engraved with her name, and at the center of it all, a necklace far larger, and far more elaborate than the modest pendant she had refused 3 days earlier, its stones catching the light in a way that made several of her neighbors, who had gathered at the edges of the street to watch, audibly gasp. Elena stood very still, looking at the chest, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but close cousins to both. "Tell your king," she said finally, her voice steady despite the crowd now gathering behind her, "that a bigger gift is not a different answer." "My answer has not changed." The young guard's face went pale. "My lady, I cannot return this. The king was very clear that—" "Then leave it here," Elena said, "and I will send it back myself." She did exactly that. By the time the sun set that evening, the chest sat sealed once more on the back of a borrowed wagon, driven by Nora's younger brother, who complained the entire way that he had never expected his afternoon to include personally delivering an insult to the Alpha King. Word of the second refusal reached the palace before the wagon did. Damian Cross read the report from his study window, the wagon and its returned chest visible even from that distance as it rolled back through the palace gates. He did not raise his voice. He did not throw anything, though his advisor Felix, standing near the door with his hands clasped behind his back, had clearly braced for exactly that. "She sent it back," Damian said, more to himself than to Felix. "All of it." "Yes, my king." "Every piece." "Every piece," Felix confirmed. And then, because he had served Damian long enough to know when silence was more dangerous than speech, he added carefully, "Perhaps she simply does not understand the significance of such gifts. Perhaps a private conversation, rather than another public gesture, would—" "She understands," Damian said. "That is precisely the problem. A woman who did not understand would have kept the jewels and said nothing at all. She understood exactly what I was offering, and she rejected it twice, in front of witnesses both times." Felix said nothing. There was little to say to a king who had, for the first time in living memory, been refused not once, but twice by the same woman, and who did not seem angry so much as genuinely, thoroughly confused by the experience. Damian had ruled the Northern Territories for 6 years, since his father's death had placed the weight of the crown on shoulders that were, at the time, barely old enough to carry it. In those 6 years, he had faced rival pacts testing his borders, nobles testing his patience, and enemies testing his resolve in every way a king could be tested. He had won every one of those contests through some combination of strength, patience, and the simple fact that people generally did what he asked, whether out of respect or fear, or some blend of the two that he had long since stopped trying to separate. No one refused him. Not because he demanded blind obedience, but because refusal, in his experience, was simply not a thing that happened to men in his position. Requests were granted. Gifts were accepted. Even his rare moments of vulnerability, offered carefully to a select few, were met with gratitude rather than rejection. Elena Voss had broken that pattern twice in the span of 3 days, and Damian found himself doing something he had not done in longer than he could remember. He found himself thinking about someone who wanted nothing from him at all. "Tell me what you know about her," he said. Felix, who had clearly anticipated this request and prepared for it, opened a small leather folder he had been carrying. Elena Voss, 26 years of age, trained as a healer under Margaret Ashworth for the past 14 years, formerly of the Eastern Hollow Pack, though she left them 5 years ago, under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear. Unclear how? The official record states she relocated for training purposes. Unofficially, Felix hesitated, there are rumors of a difficult attachment, a mate or near mate who did not treat her well. Nothing confirmed, my king. The Eastern Hollow Pack is not eager to discuss the matter, which itself suggests there is something worth discussing. Damian was quiet for a long moment, turning this information over the way he turned over any piece of intelligence, looking for the shape of the truth beneath the gaps in the record. A gift given carelessly, once, might be refused out of pride, or caution, or simple misunderstanding of intention. But a gift refused twice, each time more firmly than the last, from a woman with a history of walking away from something that had once looked like love, was not pride. It was something closer to protection. "She is not refusing me," Damian said slowly, almost to himself. "She is refusing what the gift represents." Felix, wisely, said nothing, though his expression suggested he was not entirely certain his king had reached the correct conclusion. Prepare my horse, Damien said. I want to see the northern border myself. It has been too long since I inspected it in person. My king. The northern border inspection was completed only 2 months ago, and the northern village happens to be. I am aware of where the village is located, Felix. Felix bowed his head, hiding whatever expression had crossed his face, and left to prepare the horses. News of the king's planned journey moved through the palace almost as quickly as news of the return chest had moved through the village 3 days earlier. By evening, half the court seemed to know that Damien Cross intended to travel north himself, ostensibly to inspect border defenses that had already been inspected, and everyone with any political sense understood the true reason without needing it spoken aloud. His mother, the dowager, found him in the armory that evening, checking over gear he had not personally checked in years, since he generally trusted his guards to handle such matters. You are going to see the healer, she said. It was not a question. Damien did not deny it. I am going to inspect the border. Damien. His mother's voice carried the particular patience of a woman who had raised a stubborn son and learned over many years exactly how much of that stubbornness she could push against before it hardened into something immovable. A king does not chase after a woman who has refused him twice. It makes him look weak, in front of every noble house watching. I am not chasing her, Damien said, though even as he said it, he was aware of how little conviction the words carried. I am curious. There is a difference. Is there? He did not answer, because he was not entirely certain himself, and the dowager, recognizing the particular silence of a son who had already made up his mind despite his mother's better judgment, simply sighed and left him to his preparations. The following morning, Damien rode north with a small escort, far smaller than his usual traveling party, which he told himself was simply practical given the short distance, though Felix noted privately that it was also considerably less conspicuous than a full royal procession would have been. The journey took the better part of a day, through hills still green with late summer, and forests that thinned gradually into farmland as they approached the village. Damien had traveled these roads before, as a boy accompanying his father, and later as king, inspecting the borders his family had sworn to protect. He had never once, in all those journeys, felt the particular restlessness that settled into his chest as the village came into view. He told himself it was simply the unfamiliar experience of being refused. He told himself it was pride, wounded and seeking resolution. He told himself several things, in fact, during that ride, and believed almost none of them by the time the village gates came into sight. Elena, unaware that a king was approaching her home for the second time in less than a week, was in the middle of setting a broken arm when the commotion began outside. The scream from outside was not one of alarm but of excitement, the particular pitch of village children who had spotted something far more interesting than their afternoon chores. Elena finished tying off the splint on young Tobias Ward's arm, told him firmly to stay seated no matter what he heard outside, and stepped out of the workshop just as the royal escort came into view at the end of the street. Her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with fear of the guards, and everything to do with recognizing, even at this distance, the particular way Damien Cross sat his horse, straight-backed and watchful, scanning the street as though searching for someone in particular. He found her within seconds. Their eyes met across the width of the village square, and for a moment neither of them moved, while everyone around them very much did, villagers abandoning stalls and doorways to gather at a respectful distance, whispering behind raised hands. Damien dismounted and walked toward her, and Elena noticed, despite herself, that he had come without the ceremonial coat he had worn in the great hall, without the elaborate chain of office that usually marked his rank. He wore simple traveling clothes, the kind any wolf might wear on a long ride, and it took her a moment to understand that this was, in its own way, a message. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing because the crowd expected it, though her voice carried none of the warmth the title usually implied. "I am here to inspect the northern border," Damien said, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear, though his eyes never left her face. It seemed prudent to also check on the healer, who saved 12 of my guards last winter, given how quickly that healer seems to be developing a reputation for refusing gifts from her king. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd, breaking some of the tension. Elena felt her cheeks warm, though whether from embarrassment or something closer to annoyance, she could not quite decide. "I would speak with you," Damien said, quieter now, if you have a moment to spare. She did not, technically, have a moment to spare. Tobias was still waiting in the workshop, and 2 more patients were due before evening. But refusing a king's request for conversation, in front of half the village, felt like a different kind of battle than refusing his gifts, and she was not certain she had the appetite for 2 confrontations in 1 week. "Walk with me to the river," she said finally. "I need to gather willow bark before the light fades." It was not the answer he had expected, judging by the slight lift of his eyebrows, but he fell into step beside her without complaint, leaving his guards and the gathered crowd behind, at a distance that allowed for something resembling privacy. They walked in silence for a while, past the last of the village houses and into the trees that lined the riverbank, the sound of running water growing louder as they went. Elena knelt beside a willow tree and began stripping bark with the small knife she carried, grateful for the excuse to keep her hands busy and her eyes away from his. "You could have simply told the messenger to keep the chest," Damien said eventually. "Sold it, given it away, kept it in storage, and never looked at it again. Instead, you sent it back within hours." "Keeping it would have meant something," Elena said. "I did not want it to mean that." "What did you think it meant?" She paused her work, looking up at him for the first time since they had left the village. He was standing with his hands loosely at his sides, watching her with an expression she could not quite categorize. Curiosity, certainly, but something gentler beneath it, something that looked almost like patience. "I know what a moonstone pendant means among our people," she said. "I know what it means when a king gives it in front of his entire court. It is not a gift for a healer who saved some guards. It is a claim." "It was an offer," Damien corrected. "Not a claim. There is a difference." "Is there?" Elena echoed his mother's earlier words without knowing it. "An offer from a king is not the same as an offer from anyone else. When you offer something in front of 100 witnesses, refusing it becomes an act of defiance rather than a simple choice. You did not give me room to say no quietly. You gave me a stage, and then acted surprised when I used it." Damien was quiet for a moment, and Elena watched something shift in his expression, the beginning of understanding, perhaps, or at least the beginning of reconsidering an assumption he had carried into this conversation. "You think I did it deliberately," he said, "to trap you." "I think," Elena said carefully, choosing her words the way she chose herbs, weighing each one, before adding it to the mixture, "that men in positions like yours are so accustomed to their gifts being welcomed that it does not occur to you how much pressure comes attached to them. You did not mean to trap me. But the effect would have been the same either way, had I accepted." He absorbed this in silence, and for the first time since she had met him, Elena saw something on his face that looked genuinely uncertain. A king unaccustomed to being told that his generosity might look, from another angle, like a kind of weight. "I saved 12 of your guards because it was the right thing to do," she continued, returning to her work, stripping another length of bark with quick, practiced motions. "Not because I wanted a reward, and certainly not because I wanted to be claimed by anyone, king or otherwise. I have spent the last 5 years building a life that belongs entirely to me. I am not interested in trading that away, no matter how beautiful the gift." 5 years, Damien repeated. "Felix mentioned you left your former pack around that time." Elena's hands stilled briefly, before resuming their work. "Felix has been thorough. I asked him to be." Damien crouched beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, even in the cool shade of the riverbank, though he made no move to touch her. "I am not asking to pry into old wounds, Elena. I am asking because I would rather understand you than simply assume I know your reasons." She looked at him then, really looked, past the crown and the title and the reputation that preceded him into every room, and saw instead a man crouched by a riverbank in plain traveling clothes, waiting patiently for an answer he had not demanded. "There was someone," she said finally, the words coming slower than she intended. "Before I came here, he gave me gifts too, in the beginning, beautiful ones. I thought they meant he loved me." She paused, watching the water move past them, steady and indifferent to the weight of old memories. "It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand that every gift came with an expectation attached, and that the expectations grew heavier each time I accepted one. By the time I understood what was happening, I had very little left of myself that felt like my own choice." Damien did not speak for a long moment. When he did, His voice had lost the careful formality it usually carried. "I am not that man." "I don't know that," Elena said honestly. "I have known you for less than a week, across 2 brief and very public encounters. I have no way of knowing what kind of man you are when the gifts stop and the expectations remain." It was, she thought afterward, one of the most honest things she had ever said to anyone, let alone a king, and she braced herself for the anger or wounded pride she expected in response. Instead, Damien nodded slowly, as though she had given him something valuable rather than an insult. "Then I will have to show you," he said, "rather than simply tell you." "Show me how." "By asking for nothing," he said. "By giving you time, rather than gifts, to decide what you think of me. Would that be acceptable?" Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the particular kind of insincerity she had learned, painfully, to recognize in another man's promises. She did not find it, though she reminded herself that absence of proof was not the same as proof of absence, and that trust, once broken, rebuilt itself slowly, if it rebuilt itself at all. "Time," she said finally. "I can accept." It was not agreement to anything more than that, and Damien seemed to understand this, nodding once and rising to his feet without pressing further. But as they walked back toward the village together, the guards and crowd still waiting at a respectful distance, Elena found herself aware of something she had not expected to feel after 2 encounters built entirely on refusal. She found herself, cautiously, curious about what came next. The following weeks brought no more grand gifts, no chests of jewels or moonstone pendants, though Damien did not disappear entirely from her life either. He found reasons to visit the northern border with unusual frequency, always announced in advance, always brief, and always accompanied by conversations that had nothing to do with claims or gifts, and everything to do with the small, ordinary details of the life she had built for herself. He asked about her work, listening with genuine attention as she explained the properties of different herbs, the particular challenges of treating shifter injuries that healed faster than a normal wound, but sometimes healed wrong, if not set correctly. He asked about Margaret, about Nora, about the village itself, and Elena found herself answering more openly each time, surprised by how easy it became to talk to a man she had once been so certain she needed to keep at arm's length. Word of these visits spread through the village, and eventually through the palace as well, and the story that had begun with 2 very public refusals began, slowly, to shift into something the court did not quite know how to categorize. The king was not courting her, not officially. He gave no more gifts. He made no more grand declarations in crowded halls, but he kept returning, week after week, and anyone with eyes could see that his reasons had very little to do with border inspections. Elena told herself, during the quiet hours when doubt crept back in, that she was simply being cautious, gathering information the way she gathered herbs, testing each new piece of evidence against her hard-won instincts before deciding whether to trust it. But somewhere in the 3rd week of his visits, watching him kneel beside Tobias Ward to examine the boy's now fully healed arm, with genuine interest rather than performative kindness, she noticed that her instincts had stopped sounding warnings quite so loudly. She did not know yet what that meant. She only knew that the careful walls she had built 5 years ago, brick by painful brick, were shifting in ways she had not expected, and was not entirely certain how to stop, even if some quiet part of her no longer wanted to. Smoke rose from the eastern ridge before dawn, thin gray columns visible even from the northern village, and by the time Elena reached the edge of town, half the pack's able wolves were already gathering weapons and armor, with the grim efficiency of people who had drilled for exactly this moment, more times than they cared to count. "Scouts from the Ashen Vale pack," Nora said, breathless, catching up to Elena near the well. "Victor Hale's people. They've been testing the border for a week, but this morning, they burned 2 grain stores near the eastern farms." Elena's chest tightened. She had heard the name Victor Hale mentioned in low, worried tones during Damien's visits. A rival alpha, whose territory bordered the northern territories to the east. A wolf, whose ambitions had grown considerably bolder in recent months. She had not understood, until this moment, how close those ambitions had crept toward the quiet life she had built. "Where is the king?" she asked. "Riding for the eastern border, with his personal guard," Nora said, "left before sunrise." Felix stayed behind to organize the healers and additional defense. Elena did not remember deciding to run toward the healer's station rather than away from the danger, but her feet carried her there regardless. Years of training overriding whatever instinct for self-preservation might have suggested a different path. By mid-morning, the healer's station had transformed into something resembling a small hospital, cots lined against every available wall, Margaret directing junior healers with brisk efficiency, while Elena moved between patients, setting bones, cleaning wounds, and doing her best to keep her hands steady despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach, with every new arrival brought in from the border. The wounded came in waves throughout the day, guards with claw marks and broken ribs, a young scout with a wound deep enough that Elena's hands shook slightly as she worked to close it, forcing herself to breathe slowly and focus on the wound rather than the fear behind it. Between patients, she caught fragments of news carried back by messengers, the border holding but barely, Victor Hale's forces larger than anyone had anticipated, the king himself, in the thick of the fighting, rather than directing from a safe distance behind his lines. That last piece of news settled into her stomach like a stone she could not dislodge, no matter how many times she told herself that Damian Cross was a trained warrior, that leading from the front was simply what Alpha Kings did, that her fear for his safety was nothing more than concern for an ally rather than anything deeper. She did not entirely believe her own reassurances, and she did not have time to examine why. By late afternoon, word came that the border had held, that Victor Hale's forces had retreated after suffering heavier losses than expected, and a ragged cheer moved through the healer's station, even as more wounded continued to arrive, evidence that holding the border had come at a considerable cost. Elena was elbow-deep in bandaging a young guard's shoulder when she heard the commotion at the entrance, the particular hush that fell over a crowded room when someone important walked through it. She looked up to see Damian himself, dust and blood streaked across his traveling clothes, one arm held slightly awkward against his side, moving through the station with the deliberate stride of a man refusing to acknowledge how much pain he was in. "You should be resting," she said, abandoning her current patient to Margaret's care, and crossing the room toward him, before she had fully decided to do so. "I wanted to see the wounded first," Damian said, though the tightness around his eyes suggested Elena's assessment of his condition was considerably more accurate than his own. "How many have we lost?" "None yet, though we came close with 2 of them," Elena said, already reaching for his injured arm, with the automatic assessment of long habit, pressing gently along his ribs until he winced. Cracked ribs, at minimum, possibly worse. "Sit down before I make you sit down." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, at being ordered rather than deferred to, but he sat on the nearest empty cot without argument, which told Elena more about the severity of his injury than any complaint could have. She worked quickly, wrapping his ribs with practiced efficiency, aware of him watching her the entire time, with an intensity that had nothing to do with pain, and everything to do with something else entirely, something she was too focused on her work to fully examine. "Victor Hale will try again," Damian said quietly, once she had finished. "He tested our defenses today, and found them stronger than he expected, but he will not simply give up. Men like him rarely do." "Then you'll need to be stronger next time," Elena said, "which means resting now, rather than insisting on inspecting every wounded soldier in this room, before your own injuries have been properly treated." "You saved 12 of my guards in winter," Damian said, ignoring her instruction entirely. "You saved considerably more than that today. I have not properly thanked you for either."
"You tried to thank me with a moonstone pendant and a chest full of jewels," Elena reminded him, though there was less edge in her voice than there might have been weeks earlier. "Both times went rather poorly, if I recall."
A faint, exhausted smile crossed his face, the first she had seen from him since he'd walked through the door. "I remember. I have been more careful since then." "You have," she agreed, and found herself smiling slightly in return, despite the exhaustion pulling at her own limbs after a full day of treating the wounded. They sat together for a moment in a rare pocket of quiet within the chaos of the healer's station, and Elena became aware, gradually, of how close he was sitting, of the particular way his eyes held hers, without the calculating distance of a king assessing an asset, and instead, with something that looked, for the first time, entirely unguarded. "I was afraid for you today," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "When they said you were fighting on the front line rather than directing from behind it, I found myself considerably more afraid than I expected to be." "Elena." Her name in his voice carried a different weight than it had in the great hall weeks earlier. Quieter, warmer, entirely without the formal distance of a king addressing a subject. I have led wolves into battle more times than I can easily count. I have never once, until today, thought about someone waiting behind the lines while I did. She did not know what to say to that, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the noise of the healer's station fading into background hum around the small, quiet space they had carved out between them. Rest, she said finally, because it was easier than examining the feeling settling warm and unfamiliar in her chest. We can discuss the rest another day. He nodded, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer before he allowed himself to lie back against the cot, and Elena moved on to her next patient, with hands that were not quite as steady as they had been an hour earlier, though this time, she noted with some surprise, the unsteadiness had nothing at all to do with fear. 3 weeks after the attack on the eastern border, a letter arrived at Elena's workshop that made her drop the mortar and pestle she had been holding, its contents scattering across the floor unnoticed. The seal was not the royal crest of the Northern Territories. It was a different mark entirely, one she recognized instantly despite the 5 years since she had last seen it, the twisted oak symbol of the Eastern Hollow Pack, the pack she had left behind when she fled a life that had slowly closed around her like a fist. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal, and the words inside confirmed what her stomach had already guessed before her mind caught up. Gideon Marsh had heard the rumors. Somehow, across the distance between their two territories, word of a king's public gifts, and even more public rejections, had reached the ears of the man Elena had spent 5 years trying to forget. The letter was brief, deceptively gentle in tone, the same careful, persuasive warmth she remembered from the early days of their relationship, before that warmth had revealed the cold calculation underneath. He wrote that he had heard she was well. He wrote that he hoped she had found happiness, though something in the phrasing made the words feel less like a genuine wish and more like a test. He wrote that he would be traveling through the Northern Territories on pack business in the coming month, and that he hoped, given how much time had passed, she might be willing to meet with him, to put old misunderstandings to rest. Elena read the letter 3 times before she was certain she had understood it correctly, and each reading left her feeling colder than the last. She found Margaret in the herb garden behind the workshop, kneeling among the rows of chamomile, with the particular focus of someone who had spent decades learning exactly which plants healed and which ones, in the wrong hands, could harm. "He wants to meet me," Elena said, holding out the letter with a hand that would not quite stop shaking. Margaret read it in silence, her expression darkening with each line, and when she finished, she folded the letter carefully and handed it back without comment on its contents, an old healer's habit of gathering all the information before offering an opinion. "What do you want to do?" she asked instead. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "Part of me wants to refuse entirely, to pretend the letter never arrived. Another part of me wonders if refusing would only convince him that I'm still afraid of him, still running, rather than simply choosing not to engage." "Are you afraid of him?" Elena considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she turned over an unfamiliar plant, before deciding whether it belonged in a healing mixture or a poison. "I used to be," she said finally. "I think, now, I am more afraid of what meeting him might undo than of what he could actually do to me." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding the distinction, in the way only someone who had watched Elena rebuild herself, piece by piece, over 5 long years, could understand it. "Have you told the king?" The question landed harder than Elena expected. She had not, in fact, told Damien anything about Gideon, beyond the vague admission by the riverbank weeks earlier, that there had been someone before, someone whose gifts had come with expectations attached. She had not named him. She had not explained the particular shape of what those years had cost her, the small ways she had learned to disappear inside her own life in order to avoid conflict, the longer, harder years afterward spent learning how to take up space again. "Not yet," she said. "Perhaps you should." Elena did not go to the palace that day, or the next, turning the decision over in her mind while she continued her work, treating the ordinary illnesses and injuries of village life with hands that felt steadier with each passing hour, even as her thoughts remained tangled around the letter tucked into the bottom drawer of her workshop desk. It was Damien, in the end, who found her, arriving for one of his now familiar visits, and noticing immediately that something had shifted in her demeanor, a careful distance that had not been there during their last several conversations. "Something is wrong," he said, without preamble, once they had walked far enough from the village center to speak privately. Elena considered deflecting, the way she had deflected so many uncomfortable conversations over the past 5 years, but something about the quiet steadiness of his presence, the way he waited for her answer without pressing or assuming, made her reconsider. "I received a letter," she said, and told him everything. She told him about Gideon Marsh, about the early years of gifts and affection that had gradually revealed themselves to be tools of control, rather than genuine love. She told him about the slow, suffocating years that followed, learning to shrink herself to fit whatever version of her Gideon wanted on any given day, until the woman who finally fled Eastern Hollow barely resembled the girl who had first fallen for his careful charm. She told him about the letter's careful, deceptive gentleness, and the fear that meeting him again might unravel 5 years of hard-won healing. Damien listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail, though the darkness felt protective rather than possessive, concern rather than the wounded pride of a man discovering competition for something he considered his own. "You do not have to meet him," he said when she finished. "You do not owe him anything, least of all the courtesy of putting old wounds to rest for his convenience." "I know," Elena said, "but I also don't want to spend the rest of my life flinching every time his name appears on a letter. I want to face him, once, on my own terms, and prove to myself that he no longer has any power over me." "Then face him on your own terms," Damien said. "But you will not face him alone." "Damien, I am not asking permission, Elena, and I am not offering this as another gift you feel obligated to refuse." His voice carried none of the formal authority of a king issuing commands, only quiet, steady conviction. "I am telling you that whatever you decide, I will be there, not to fight your battles for you, but so that you know, without doubt, that you do not have to face this alone, unless that is truly what you want." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for the particular calculation she had learned to recognize in Gideon's expressions, the subtle angling of every kindness toward some eventual advantage. She found none of it, only steady, unguarded concern, offered without expectation of anything in return. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant it more deeply than the simple words could fully express. They agreed, in the end, that Elena would send a brief reply to Gideon's letter, neither refusing outright nor granting the private meeting he had requested, but instead inviting him to visit the northern village on a specific date, in public, where the weight of old memories would have less room to twist itself around her. The weeks leading up to that meeting passed slowly, each day bringing Elena closer to a confrontation she had spent 5 years avoiding, and closer, too, to a growing certainty about the man who had insisted on standing beside her through it, asking nothing in return. Gideon Marsh arrived on a gray afternoon, exactly as the letter had promised, riding into the village square with 2 attendants, and the same easy, practiced smile Elena remembered from years earlier, the smile that had once made her believe every careful word coming out of his mouth. She had chosen the square deliberately, the busiest part of the village at midday, with Margaret's workshop close enough that she could retreat if needed, and Nora positioned near the well with instructions to intervene loudly if anything felt wrong. Damien stood a short distance away, close enough to reach her quickly, far enough to make it clear this was her confrontation to lead, rather than his to manage. "Elena." Gideon's voice carried the same warm, deceptive gentleness the letter had promised, and for one dizzying moment, she felt 5 years fall away entirely, felt herself standing once again, as the girl who had believed every word this man said. "You look well. Better than I expected, honestly." "I am well," she said, and was relieved to hear that her voice remained steady, despite the way her pulse had quickened at the sight of him. "I have thought about you often," Gideon continued, taking a small step closer, though Elena held her ground rather than retreating. "About what happened between us. I know I made mistakes, Elena. I have had 5 years to reflect on them, and I would like the chance to make things right, if you would give me that chance." The words were carefully chosen, Elena recognized, the particular vagueness of mistakes, doing considerable work to avoid actually naming what he had done, the small cruelties disguised as concern, the gifts that had slowly become chains, the years of feeling herself disappear a little more with each passing month. "What mistakes exactly?" she asked. Gideon's smile flickered, just slightly, clearly not having anticipated the question being turned back on him so directly. "I was controlling," he said, after a pause. "I know that now. I wanted you close, and I did not always express that in healthy ways." "You isolated me from my friends," Elena said, her voice growing steadier with each word, as though naming the truth aloud stripped away some of the power it had once held over her. "You told me which pack gatherings I was allowed to attend, and which ones would embarrass you. You gave me gifts, and then reminded me of them whenever I disagreed with you, as though gratitude should have silenced my own opinions. You told me, more than once, that no one else would want someone as difficult as me, and I believed you, because you had made certain I had no one else close enough to tell me otherwise." The village square had gone quiet around them, villagers pausing their afternoon errands to watch, though Elena barely noticed, focused entirely on the man in front of her, and the words she had rehearsed silently for 5 years, without ever expecting the chance to say them aloud. Gideon's expression had shifted from practiced warmth into something harder, more familiar, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the frustration beneath it. "That is not entirely fair, Elena. You were young. You misunderstood my intentions." "I understood them perfectly," Elena said. "That is precisely why I left. And now you've simply traded one powerful man for another," Gideon said, his eyes flicking toward Damien for the first time, his voice taking on an edge that had not been there a moment earlier. "I hear the Alpha King has been quite generous with his gifts. I wonder if you understand his intentions any better than you understood mine." Elena felt Damien shift beside her, though he made no move to step forward, allowing her the space to answer for herself. "I refused his gifts," Elena said, "twice, in fact, and he did not punish me for it, or manipulate me into changing my mind, or tell me I was foolish for saying no. He listened. He asked questions, instead of making demands. He offered me time instead of pressure." She held Gideon's gaze steadily. "That is the difference you clearly still do not understand, Gideon. It was never about the gifts themselves. It was about whether the person offering them respected my right to refuse." Gideon's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena saw something flash across his face that looked almost like the anger she remembered from their final months together. The anger that had made her finally understand she needed to leave, before that anger found a more dangerous outlet. But he was standing in a crowded square, in territory that did not belong to his pack, with witnesses on every side, and whatever restraint remained in him held firm. "I see," he said finally, his voice cold now, stripped of its earlier warmth. "Then I suppose I have made this journey for nothing." "You have," Elena agreed. "I wish you well, Gideon, genuinely, but I do not wish to see you again, and I would ask that you respect that wish, the same way you never respected my wishes when we were together." For a long moment, Gideon said nothing, and Elena wondered if he might argue further, might try one last time to reshape the conversation into something that favored him. Instead, he simply nodded once, sharp and final, and turned back toward his waiting attendants without another word, mounting his horse and riding out of the village square as quickly as he had arrived. Elena stood very still, watching him go, waiting for the flood of relief she had expected to feel, and found instead something quieter and more complicated settling into her chest. The particular exhaustion of finally setting down a weight she had carried for so long, she had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Damien stepped closer once Gideon had disappeared from view, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, though he did not touch her, waiting instead for whatever she needed in that moment. "You did not need me at all," he said quietly. "No," Elena agreed, "but I am glad you were here regardless." She turned to look at him then, and found him watching her with an expression that held none of the calculation she had once learned to fear in Gideon's eyes, only quiet, patient admiration for the woman who had just stood her ground without flinching. "I have known for some time," Damien said carefully, "that whatever I feel for you has grown into something considerably more complicated than gratitude for saving my guards. I did not say so before, because I did not want you to feel any pressure to respond in kind, particularly not while Gideon's letter was still weighing on you." He paused. "But I think, perhaps, it is time I said it plainly. I care for you, Elena, not because of anything you can offer me, and not because a king is expected to have a mate at his side. but because you are the first person in longer than I can remember who has never once wanted anything from me beyond honesty." Elena's chest tightened, though this time the feeling carried none of the fear that had accompanied similar declarations in the past. "I care for you too," she admitted, the words feeling both terrifying and freeing in equal measure. "I have for some time, though I was not ready to say so, until I had faced Gideon, and proven to myself that I could stand on my own, before choosing to stand beside anyone else." "And now?" Damien asked. "Now," Elena said, "I think I am ready to see what standing beside you might actually look like, so long as it remains a choice I get to make freely, again and again, rather than a claim placed on me all at once." Something in Damien's expression softened into an openness she had not seen from him before, not the careful control of a king, but the unguarded relief of a man who had genuinely feared his feelings might not be returned. "Freely," he agreed. "Always freely, Elena. That is a promise I intend to keep." The horn sounded across the eastern ridge before the sun had fully risen. 3 sharp blasts that every wolf in the northern territories had been trained since childhood to recognize as the signal for full invasion rather than a mere border skirmish. And within minutes, the entire palace had erupted into organized, purposeful chaos. Elena was already awake, having stayed the night in the healer's quarters near the palace after a difficult birth the evening before, and she reached the main courtyard just as Damien emerged from the war room, already dressed for battle. Felix and a dozen commanders trailing behind him with maps and reports clutched in urgent hands. "Victor Hale," Damien said, catching sight of her and crossing the courtyard in quick strides. "He has moved his entire force across the eastern border overnight, faster and in greater numbers than any of our scouts anticipated. This is not another test, Elena. This is a full assault." Her heart clenched at the grim certainty in his voice, though she forced herself to focus on the practical, rather than the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "How can I help?" "The healers are already organizing at the eastern outpost," Damien said. "I need you there, though I confess, some part of me would rather keep you here, far from any danger." "You know I won't accept that," Elena said, and something in his expression, despite the gravity of the moment, softened briefly into something almost like a smile. "I know," he said. "It is one of the many reasons I love you." The words landed between them with quiet weight, the first time either of them had spoken that particular word aloud, though there was no time to dwell on it, the courtyard already emptying as commanders moved toward their positions and messengers scattered in every direction. "Come back to me," Elena said, gripping his arm briefly before he could turn away. "Whatever happens today, come back." "I intend to," Damien said, "though I would ask the same of you. Stay near the healer's line. Do not push forward, regardless of how badly you want to help." She did not fully keep that promise, though she would later argue, in her own defense, that circumstances beyond her control had made it impossible to keep. The battle at the eastern border raged through the entire day, waves of Victor Hale's forces crashing against the Northern Territory's defenses, with a ferocity that suggested Hale had committed everything to this single assault, understanding perhaps that a failure here would cost him any future chance at expansion. Elena worked at the healer's outpost from dawn until well past midday, treating wound after wound, watching young guards carried in on makeshift stretchers, with an efficiency that left little room for the fear she carried quietly beneath her focus. It was mid-afternoon when the messenger arrived, breathless and pale, with news that sent ice through Elena's veins, despite the warmth of the summer day. The king had been separated from his personal guard during a push against Hale's eastern flank, caught in a small ambush meant specifically to draw him away from the main battle lines. Elena did not think. She grabbed her healing bag, ignored Margaret's sharp warning to stay put, and followed the messenger toward the sound of fighting, moving faster than she had moved in years, driven by a fear that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the man she had promised, only hours earlier, that she would wait for. She found the ambush site in a small clearing, 3 of Hale's warriors already fallen, 2 of Damien's guards wounded but alive, and Damien himself standing over a 4th attacker, breathing hard, blood soaking through a wound at his side that he was clearly trying to ignore. "Elena!" His voice carried a mixture of relief and alarm as she emerged from the tree line. "You should not be here. Neither should you be standing when you're bleeding that badly," she shot back, already moving toward him, her healing bag open before she had fully processed the danger still present in the clearing. The remaining warrior, seeing his fellow attackers fallen and sensing the tide had turned against him, made one final desperate lunge, not toward Damien, who was armed and alert despite his injury, but toward Elena, clearly recognizing her as the more vulnerable target. Damien moved faster than Elena had ever seen anyone move, placing himself between her and the attacking warrior, with a speed that spoke of years of battle instinct, taking a glancing blow across his already wounded side that made him stagger, though he did not fall, driving the attacker back with a final, decisive strike that ended the confrontation entirely. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the distant sounds of battle still raging elsewhere along the border, and Elena rushed to Damien's side as he finally allowed himself to sink to one knee, the adrenaline that had carried him through the fight beginning to fade against the reality of his injuries. "You are hurt," she said, hands already moving with practiced efficiency to assess the damage, her voice tight with a fear she no longer tried to hide. "I will survive," Damien said, though his voice had grown considerably weaker than it had been moments earlier. "You should not have followed the messenger, Elena. You could have been killed, and you could have died protecting me from a threat I would have avoided entirely, had I stayed where you asked," Elena countered, though there was no real anger in her voice, only the particular fierce concern of someone tending to a wound while their hands trembled with the effort of staying steady. She worked quickly, packing the wound at his side with clean cloth from her bag, applying pressure, while calling for the two wounded guards to help carry him back toward the healer's outpost. Damien's grip found her hand at some point during the journey back, weak but insistent, and Elena held on tightly, refusing to let go despite the practical difficulties it created for her work. "I saved 12 of your guards last winter," she said quietly, more to keep him conscious and talking than for any other reason, as they made their way back toward the safety of the healer's line. "I saved considerably more during the Eastern assault 3 weeks ago, and now, apparently, I am adding my king to that list." A weak, exhausted laugh escaped him, quickly followed by a wince as the movement pulled against his wound. "I would have thought," he managed, "that after everything, you might have grown tired of saving me." "Never," Elena said, and meant it with a certainty that surprised even herself. "Not now, not ever, Damien. I intend to keep saving you for as long as you'll let me." They reached the healer's outpost as the sounds of battle finally began to fade in the distance, word spreading that Victor Hale's forces had broken and retreated once more, this time with losses severe enough that most commanders believed it would be years before Ashenvale attempted another assault on the northern territories. Damien's wound, though serious, proved treatable, and Elena spent the following hours at his bedside, refusing to leave despite Margaret's gentle insistence that she rest, watching over him with the particular vigilance of someone who understood, now more deeply than ever, exactly how much she stood to lose. When he finally woke, hours later, his first words were not about the battle, or Victor Hale, or the political consequences of the day's events. His first words, quiet and rough with exhaustion, were simply her name, and the relief in his eyes when he found her sitting beside him told Elena everything she needed to know about how completely their understanding of each other had shifted, from cautious guardedness into something that neither of them was interested in questioning any longer. Damien's recovery took the better part of 2 weeks, during which Elena barely left his side, and by the time he was fully back on his feet, something fundamental had shifted between them, that neither felt any need to hide from the court that had once whispered so eagerly about the king's public rejections. But it was during those quiet weeks of recovery that Damien began to understand something he had not fully grasped in all his earlier, grander gestures. He had offered Elena a moonstone pendant, meant to claim her before the entire court. He had sent a chest full of jewels meant to overwhelm whatever hesitation his first gift had caused. Both had been generous in the way a king understood generosity, valuable, elaborate, undeniable in their significance. Both had also, he now realized, asked something of her before she had ever been given the chance to offer anything freely herself. He called for Felix on a quiet afternoon, still confined to his chambers by Elena's strict orders regarding his continued healing, and asked for something considerably different than jewels or gold. "I want to gather the court," Damien said, "not for a celebration, not for another gift. I want to make a declaration, and I want Elena present when I make it. Felix, who had grown accustomed over the past months to his king's unpredictable requests where Elena Voss was concerned, simply nodded and began making arrangements. The following week, the great hall filled once more, with the same nobles and courtiers who had witnessed Elena's first refusal months earlier. The same hall, where whispers about her audacity had first begun to spread through every corner of the palace. Elena stood near the entrance, uncertain what exactly Damien intended, having been told only that her presence was requested, rather than given any further explanation. Damien rose from his chair as she entered, and the hall fell silent in a manner that felt entirely different from the tense, judgmental silence of that first encounter months earlier. "Many of you were present," he began, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "the day I offered a gift to Elena Voss, and the day she refused it. Many of you have since heard, in whatever exaggerated form gossip inevitably takes, about a second refusal, and about the various theories that have circulated through this court regarding what those refusals meant." Elena felt her cheeks warm slightly under the weight of every eye in the hall, though she held her ground, curious now despite her discomfort about where this speech was heading. "I want to correct the record," Damien continued, "not because Elena's refusals require correction, but because my understanding of what I was offering did." He paused, his eyes finding hers across the hall, warm and steady, despite the formal setting. "I offered her jewels because I believed, as I had been raised to believe, that generosity was the clearest expression of value a king could offer. I did not understand, at the time, that a gift given without room for genuine refusal is not truly a gift at all. It is an expectation, dressed in beautiful clothing." A murmur moved through the hall, though it carried curiosity, rather than the earlier scandalized whispers. "Elena Voss," Damien said, turning fully toward her now, "I do not stand here today to offer you jewels, or gold, or any gift that might once again ask something of you before you have chosen to give it freely. I stand here to tell this entire court, and you, that whatever choice you make regarding your future, and mine, you owe this crown nothing. You saved my guards without expectation of reward. You saved my life without hesitation, at considerable risk to your own safety. You have given more to this kingdom than any gift I could ever offer in return, and I will not insult that generosity by continuing to treat you as though you are something to be won, rather than someone whose choices deserve to be entirely her own." The hall had gone utterly silent now, every noble and courtier watching with rapt attention as Damien continued, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability of what he was about to say. "I love you, Elena, not because you saved my life, though I am endlessly grateful that you did. Not because you would make a politically advantageous mate, though I imagine several nobles in this hall have already calculated exactly that. I love you because you have never once wanted anything from me beyond honesty, and because being near you has taught me more about what genuine partnership might look like than 6 years of ruling this kingdom ever did." He took a slow breath. "I am not asking you to accept anything today. I am simply telling this court, and telling you, that my feelings do not require you to give anything in return. You are free, Elena, entirely and always, and I will protect this kingdom's alliance with your safety and well-being, regardless of whatever you decide about the rest." Elena stood very still, the weight of the entire hall's attention pressing against her, though it felt different now than it had months earlier, less like judgment and more like witness to something genuinely important unfolding in front of them. She crossed the hall slowly, aware of every step, until she stood before Damien at the base of the chair that was not quite a throne, though today it felt less like a symbol of power, and more like simply the place where a good man happened to sit. "You once told me," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "that you would show me who you were, rather than simply telling me. I did not fully believe, at the time, that a king could keep such a promise. I believe it now." A soft, surprised sound rippled through the gathered court, though Elena barely noticed, focused entirely on the man in front of her. "I do not need grand declarations or public speeches to know how I feel," she continued, "though I confess, this one has moved me considerably more than I expected. I have spent 5 years building a life that belonged entirely to me, refusing to let anyone else's generosity dictate my choices. I do not offer this lightly, and I do not offer it because a king has asked, or because a court is watching." She reached into the small pouch at her waist, drawing out a simple wooden figurine, carved carefully over many quiet evenings during his recovery, a small wolf standing beside another, neither larger than the other, neither positioned above the other. I offer it because I have chosen it, freely, exactly as you promised I would always be allowed to do. Damien took the small carving with hands that were, for the first time since Elena had known him, visibly unsteady, and the softness in his expression as he studied the two equal wolves carved so carefully into the wood spoke more clearly than any words could have. "This," he said quietly, "is worth considerably more to me than any jewel in my treasury." The hall erupted, not into scandalized whispers this time, but into genuine, warm applause, and Elena felt herself smiling, truly and fully, for the first time in that particular hall, surrounded by witnesses, to a moment that belonged entirely to her own choosing. Peace did not arrive quietly. 3 months after Damien's declaration in the Great Hall, word reached the palace that Victor Hale, still smarting from his failed assault on the eastern border, had allied himself with a smaller pack to the south, a group of mercenary wolves, known throughout the region for accepting payment, regardless of the cause, and together, they had begun moving troops toward a joint attack, meant to strike at the northern territories from 2 directions at once. Elena, now spending most of her time at the palace rather than the village, learned of the threat during a war council she had increasingly been invited to attend, her insight into the practical realities of battle wounds and recovery times proving valuable to commanders planning strategy, rather than simply treating its aftermath. "They intend to strike here," Felix said, pointing to a location on the map that made Elena's stomach tighten with recognition. A narrow pass close enough to the northern village that any battle fought there would put her old home directly in the path of danger. If they take this position, they gain a direct route into the heart of our territory. "Margaret," Elena said immediately, "Nora, the whole village is directly in the path." "We will evacuate the village before any fighting reaches it," Damien said firmly, though his expression carried the same worry Elena felt, understanding immediately why this particular threat weighed on her more heavily than others had. "I will not allow harm to come to the people who first taught this court what genuine courage looks like." The evacuation took place over 3 tense days, villagers relocating temporarily to the safety of the palace grounds, while Damien's forces moved to intercept the combined threat before it could reach the narrow pass. Elena worked tirelessly during those days, organizing the healer's response, coordinating supplies, drawing on every lesson learned during the previous battles to ensure this confrontation, whatever its outcome, would find the northern territories as prepared as possible. The battle itself, when it finally came, proved to be the most difficult the kingdom had faced in years. Victor Hale's combined forces pressing hard against defenses, stretched thin by the need to protect 2 fronts simultaneously. Elena stayed at the primary healer's station this time, having promised Damien, after a difficult conversation the night before the battle, that she would trust his commanders to protect him, rather than risking herself unnecessarily on the front lines. It was a promise she found considerably harder to keep than she had anticipated, spending the long hours of battle treating wound after wound, while fragments of news trickled back from the front, each report bringing fresh waves of fear that she forced herself to set aside, in favor of the steady, focused work her patients needed from her. By late afternoon, word arrived that shifted the entire tenor of the battle. Victor Hale himself had been captured, his mercenary allies scattering once their paid leader's forces began to collapse without his direct command, and the combined threat that had loomed so large over the previous weeks dissolved with surprising speed once its central architect had been removed from the field. Damien returned that evening, tired but unharmed, beyond minor injuries that Elena treated with hands, considerably steadier than they had been during his previous, more serious wound. Victor Hale, brought before the court in chains 2 days later, faced judgment, not with the defiance many had expected, but with the resigned acceptance of a man who understood his ambitions had finally outpaced his ability to achieve them. "You could execute me," Hale said, when Damien addressed him in the Great Hall, "and few would question the decision, given everything I have cost your territory these past months." "I could," Damien agreed, "though I find myself increasingly uninterested in ruling through fear, rather than through the kind of respect that lasts considerably longer." He glanced briefly at Elena, standing nearby, before continuing. "You will be stripped of your alpha title, and your lands will be absorbed into the northern territories, under careful oversight. ensuring the people who lived under your rule are treated fairly, regardless of your own failures. You yourself will live out your days under guard, far from any position of power, though you will live." Hale said nothing further, and was led away, and the great hall filled with quiet murmurs of approval, for a judgment that favored genuine justice over simple vengeance. The following weeks brought a peace the Northern Territories had not known in years. Victor Hale's lands absorbed smoothly, the mercenary threat from the south dispersed, and unlikely to reform without a paying leader to organize them. Elena returned to her work at the village, though she divided her time now between the healer's workshop and the palace, the two halves of her life woven together in a way that felt, increasingly, entirely natural, rather than forced. It was on a quiet evening, several weeks after Victor Hale's judgment, that Damien found her in the palace gardens, tending to a small collection of herbs she had recently transplanted from her village workshop, and something in his expression told her, before he spoke a single word, that the conversation ahead would matter more than any that had come before it. "I have been thinking," he said, settling beside her among the herb beds without any of the formal distance a king might normally maintain, "about everything that has happened since the day you first refused my gift in that great hall." "As have I," Elena admitted, brushing soil from her hands and turning to face him fully. "I do not want to offer you another gift wrapped in expectation," Damien said carefully. "I have learned, I hope, the difference between generosity and pressure. But I find myself wanting to ask you something regardless, and I want you to understand clearly that whatever you answer, nothing between us will change unless you wish it to." Elena's heart quickened, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I do not want to be your king, asking for a mate," Damien said. "I want to be the man who has watched you save lives, without hesitation, who has watched you stand your ground against every kind of pressure this court and this kingdom have thrown at you, who has come to understand, more deeply than I ever expected, what genuine partnership actually looks like." He paused, and Elena saw, for perhaps the first time since she had known him, genuine nervousness cross his face. "Would you consider building a life alongside me, Elena? Not as a gift claimed, not as a political arrangement, but as two equals choosing each other, freely and repeatedly, for as long as that choice continues to feel right to both of us?" The garden around them seemed to hold its breath, the evening light settling gold and warm across the herb beds, and Elena found herself smiling, before she had fully formed her answer, the particular kind of smile that came from a certainty she no longer needed to question. "Yes," she said simply, freely, "and for as long as it continues to feel right, exactly as you have promised from the beginning." The great hall had never looked quite like this before, and every noble who had witnessed Elena Voss's first refusal, months earlier, now found themselves seated among decorations that told an entirely different story than anyone had expected the day this tale began. There were no moonstone pendants displayed on velvet pillows. There were no chests of jewels stacked for admiration. Instead, simple wildflowers gathered from the northern hills lined the hall, the same kind Elena had spent years cultivating in her modest workshop garden, and at the front of the hall, where the not-quite throne usually sat empty and imposing, two simple chairs of equal height stood side by side. Margaret sat near the front, dressed in her finest robes despite her frequent grumbling about ceremonial fuss, and Nora stood close by, unable to stop smiling, since the moment the ceremony had begun. Even Felix, usually so composed, wore an expression that suggested genuine happiness, rather than mere professional satisfaction at a diplomatically favorable match. Elena walked into the hall not on anyone's arm, a choice she had insisted upon from the very beginning of the planning, moving down the aisle at her own pace, dressed simply but beautifully in pale blue that echoed, without anyone quite realizing it, the moonstone she had once refused so firmly. Damien waited at the front, and the expression on his face as she approached carried none of the careful control she remembered from their first meeting in this very hall. It carried instead the open, unguarded warmth of a man who had learned, slowly and carefully, exactly what it meant to offer something without demanding anything in return. "We are gathered," the elder officiating the ceremony began, once Elena had reached the front of the hall, not to witness a claim, but to witness a choice, freely made and freely renewed. It was an unusual way to open a bonding ceremony, Elena knew, most such gatherings speaking instead of duty and destiny, and the sacred weight of pack bonds formed by fate rather than deliberate choice. But she and Damien had specifically requested this framing, wanting their own beginning to reflect the particular journey that had brought them here. A journey built not on inevitability, but on two people repeatedly choosing each other, despite every reason either of them might have had to walk away. Elena Voss, the elder continued, do you choose this bond, freely and without pressure, understanding that you may always choose differently, should your heart lead you elsewhere? I do, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, and I choose it again, every day, exactly as I have chosen it since the moment I first understood what genuine partnership could look like. Damien Cross, the elder said, turning to him, do you choose this bond, freely and without expectation of anything owed to you in return? I do, Damien said, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. I choose it, not because a kingdom requires an heir, or because tradition demands a mate at my side, but because this woman has taught me more about genuine strength and genuine love than any lesson I learned in 6 years of ruling alone. The exchange of vows that followed was simple, stripped of the elaborate formality that usually accompanied royal ceremonies. Each promise focused not on possession or duty, but on partnership, freely chosen and continuously renewed. When the moment came for an exchange of tokens, Damien did not present jewels or gold. He presented instead a small pendant, far simpler than the moonstone he had once offered in this same hall, carved from northern oak rather than precious stone, shaped into 2 wolves standing side by side, mirroring the small carving Elena had once given him. This is not a claim, he said quietly, as he fastened it around her neck, his fingers steady despite the significance of the moment. It is simply a reminder, should you ever need one, that you chose this freely, and that the choice remains entirely yours to make, today and every day after. Elena felt tears gather, unbidden, as she reached up to touch the simple pendant resting against her collarbone, and she found herself thinking, briefly, of the frightened, careful woman who had once fled Eastern Hollow, with nothing but her healing skills and a fierce determination never again to let anyone else's gifts determine the shape of her life. That woman, she realized, had not been wrong to protect herself so fiercely. She had simply been waiting, all along, for someone who understood that love worth having never demanded protection be abandoned in the first place. The hall erupted into celebration. As the ceremony concluded, the same nobles who had once whispered scandalized rumors about a healer's audacious refusal, now raising their voices in genuine celebration of a partnership built on something far sturdier than any political arrangement could have offered. Later that evening, as the festivities continued around them, Damien found a quiet moment to pull Elena aside, out onto a balcony overlooking the northern hills, where her village lay peaceful beneath the stars. Do you remember, he asked, the day I offered you that first pendant, so certain you would simply accept it as any other woman in this kingdom would have? I remember, Elena said, smiling at the memory that had once felt so fraught with tension, and now simply felt like the beginning of a story she was grateful to have lived. I remember thinking you were the most confused king I had ever met, offering me something so significant, with absolutely no understanding of what it might cost me to accept it. I was confused, Damien admitted, laughing softly. I had never once, in my entire life, considered that a gift might feel like a burden rather than an honor. You taught me that, along with considerably more than I ever expected to learn, from a healer who wanted nothing to do with my crown. And I learned, Elena said, leaning against him as the stars spread bright and clear above the northern hills, that not every gift is a cage, and not every king rules through demand rather than genuine partnership. We taught each other, I think, in fairly equal measure. Equal, Damien agreed. Exactly as it should be. They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the distant lights of the village, where Elena had once built a careful, guarded life entirely her own, a life that had not been diminished by choosing to share it, but had instead grown into something richer than either of them could have imagined, on the day a healer's simple refusal first echoed through a crowded hall. The kingdom that had once whispered about a scandal soon came to tell a different story instead, one that traveled far beyond the borders of the northern territories, carried by traders and travelers who found something worth repeating in the tale of a king who had learned that the truest gift he could offer was never a possession at all, but simply the freedom to choose, and a healer who had shown an entire court that strength and gentleness could exist within the very same heart. And in the years that followed, whenever a young wolf within the Northern Territories prepared to offer a gift meant to signal devotion, the old advisors would often share the story of Elena Voss and Damian Cross, not as a lesson in romance, but as a lesson in respect, a reminder that the most valuable thing anyone could ever offer another person was never wrapped in gold or silver, but simply the patient, generous space to choose freely, again and again, for as long as that choice continued to feel true.